I think the humiliating withdrawal by the United States from Afghanistan should give them a lesson. That, okay, you were there for 20 years to send a message to Taliban to leave, but finally the Americans gave the reins of power to Taliban. Is it a good lesson? I mean, this is absolutely a humiliation for the United States and its allies. Secondly, of course, if they have left Afghanistan, they should leave also Iraq. They should leave also Syria. Consequently, we advise them to leave before it is too late, because they cannot depend on their agents. Their military might was so huge in Afghanistan, they have less presence in Syria and Iraq. So the best way for them is to leave and to leave the Syrian people to deal with their own problems. This is our people.
Latest news out of Syria. Bus bomb kills 14 in the Syrian capital of Damascus. Arab states normalize with Assad. U.S. faces dilemma in Syria. Associated Press, headliner. Bus bombs kill 14 in Syria capital. Shells escalate. Shells elsewhere killed 10. Dated October 21st, 2021. 2 bombs attached to a bus carrying Syrian troops exploded in Damascus during the rush hour Wednesday, a military official said. 14 people were killed in the attack, one of the deadliest in the capital in years. While the Syrian government's decade-long conflict with insurgents continues in parts of the country, including the rebel-held Northwest, bombings in Damascus have become exceedingly rare since President Bashir al-Assad's troops pushed opposition fighters from the capital suburbs in 2018. Shortly after the Damascus bombings, government shells landed in a rebel-held town in northern Syria, killing at least 10 people, 4 of them children. The attack, part of the government's campaign to regain control of areas still in opposition hands, was the worst violence in the region since a truce in March last year was negotiated by Turkey and Russia, allies of the opposition and Syria government, respectively. The bloody day in Syria took a relative calm that had taken hold in a war-torn country in recent months. While the conflict remains unresolved a decade later, military activists have subsided. Forces of President Assad now control much of Syria after military support from allies Russia and Iran helped tip the balance of power in his favor. U.S. and Turkish troops, meanwhile, are deployed in parts of the country's north. The explosions in Damascus, which also left several wounded, happened at a busy intersection near a main bus transfer point where commuters and school children typically converge. After the blast, Syrian state TV showed footage of smoke rising from a charred bus. The soldiers hosed down the vehicle and onlookers flocked to a nearby bridge to watch. Little-known group calling itself the Qasim Brigades claimed responsibility for the attacks, saying the bombs were attached under the bus. It added in a short statement posted on social media that attacks in government-held areas will continue in retaliation for massacres committed against our people in the liberated north. Rebel-held northwest Syria rescue workers reported 10 people were killed, including 4 children and a woman, in government shelling of a town in the last rebel enclave in the country's northwest. United Nations Deputy Regional Humanitarian Coordinator Mark Curtis described the shocking reports of the shelling that hit a market and roads near schools as students were heading to classes. Besides the 4 children killed, their teacher also died, according to UNICEF, the UN's children's agency. Today's violence is yet another reminder that the war in Syria has not come to an end. Civilians, among them children, keep bearing the brunt of a brutal, long conflict, the agency said. In recent years, attacks in Damascus have been rare. One of the last major explosions took place in 2017 when jihadist suicide bombers hit a judicial office building and a restaurant, killing 60 people. The attacks were claimed by the Islamic State. The extremist organization has not held territory in Syria since 2019, but it continues to represent a threat with sleeper cells, mostly hiding in Syria's expansive desert. State media initially described the Damascus attack as a roadside bombing, but they later quoted an unnamed Syrian military official as saying that bombs were attached to the vehicle's exterior. A third bomb fell from the bus and was dismantled by troops, the official said. It is typical for the government to realize information using anonymous sources in state media. It is not clear if all the dead were bus passengers. The Syrian Civil Defense, also known as White Helmets, said aside from the 10 killed, 20 more were wounded when dozens of shells landed in the town. It was horrifying and very tiring day, said Wael El Hussein, a surgeon in Idlib, who drove past the scene of the shelling minutes before it happened. He spent hours in the hospital afterwards operating on and otherwise treating 28 people, including many of them children. Syria's conflict began in March of 2011 and has left between 350,000 and 450,000 people dead, displaced half the country's population, including 5 million who are refugees abroad. Al Jazeera, headliner, as Arab states normalize with Assad, U.S. faces dilemma in Syria, dated October 19, 2021. Absent an unforeseen event, experts say Syria's President Bashir al-Assad is not going to lose his grip on power anytime soon, something that is moving many Arab countries to normalize relations with the government in Damascus. Thousands of kilometers away in Washington, D.C., United States policy on Syria has become a balancing act between maintaining a rejection of Assad while pursuing realistic goals in the region. The Biden administration, I think, finds itself having to negotiate between the realities on the ground across the region and its own principled posture with respect to Assad, said Mona Yacoubian, a senior advisor on Syria at the United States Institute of Peace, a U.S. government think tank. Washington, Yacoubian told Al Jazeera, is engaging in an assessment of realistic goals and objectives. Secretary of State Antony Blinken outlined the administration's policy objectives in Syria last week, saying the U.S. is focused on expanding access to humanitarian aid for Syrians, backing the campaign against the Islamic State, preserving basic international norms through pressure on the Assad government, and sustaining local ceasefires in the country. What we have not done and what we do not intend to do is express any support for efforts to normalize relations or rehabilitate Mr. Assad, or lifted a single sanction on Syria, or change our position to oppose the reconstruction of Syria until there is irreversible progress toward a political solution, Blinken said. Washington has called for Assad's departure early on in 2011. Then President Barack Obama said Assad should step down to allow for a transition to democracy in Syria. Joshua Landis, director of the Center of Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma, said the U.S. faces a dilemma in its Syrian policy. Landis told Al Jazeera, they got themselves in this terrible position where they're upholding a Syria foreign policy that's based on 10 years of bad assumptions and wrong analysis, which is that Assad was going to fall. And how do you back away from that without losing face? You can't. You have to lose face at some level, and you have to hurt your allies that you built up over 10 years. Many Arab countries previously opposed to Assad are adjusting their posture towards Syria. The United Arab Emirates, which reopened its embassy in Damascus in 2018, announced a plan to deepen economic ties with Syria earlier this month, cementing the renewed relations between the two countries. Assad further broke his isolation when he held a phone call with Jordan's King Abdullah II, a key U.S. ally, 2 weeks ago. The conversation was preceded by fully reopening a main border crossing between the two countries late in September. Egyptian Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry met with Syrian counterpart Faisal Mekdad on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly last month. The United States still maintains tight sanctions against significant sectors of the Syrian economy under the 2019 Syrian Civilian Protection Act. And as articulated by Blinken, Washington does not want reconstruction funds going to the Syrian government before there is a political solution. Amid financial crisis across the region, partly spurred by the COVID-19 pandemic, the Biden administration is expected to withhold opposition to a gas pipeline that would bring Egyptian fuel to Lebanon through Jordan and Syria. The countries are seeking World Bank funding for the project, which would likely help them evade U.S. sanctions. Yacoubian said the pipeline illustrates well how the deterioration in the region, including Lebanon's near economic collapse, is working against the U.S. administration's opposition to Assad. Went on to say it's also weighing competing national security objectives and imperatives. In the case of Lebanon, Yakubian added the U.S. has an interest in maintaining stability and countering the influence of Hezbollah, which has imported Iranian oil to the country that is suffering widespread power outages and energy shortages. For his part, Landis also said the grim economic outlook in Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq is forcing the Biden administration to make some concessions around enforcing what he called the maximum pressure regime on Syria. But the threat of congressionally mandated sanctions remains a deterrent for Arab firms looking to do business in Syria. Landis went on to say that's a tricky position to be in because if you're a businessman in the Gulf or Jordan, you don't want to mess with American laws because you never know when they're going to hammer you. Several Arab officials have called on the U.S. administration to ease sanctions against Syria. Landis said Arab states convinced that Syria and Assad will not be toppled want to get involved in the Syrian economy and try to help counterbalance the Iranian influence in the country. Landis also went on to say, I think the Arab world has come to the conclusion this is not good for us. We need to help the Syrian economy grow and give Assad alternatives to Iran. But Yakubian said she is not convinced by the argument of normalizing with Assad in order to diminish Iranian influence in Syria, calling the Syrian president unsalvageable. Republicans in Congress have already expressed their pleasure with Arab states rekindling relations with Assad. Michael McCall and Jim Risch, the top Republicans on the House and Senate Foreign Policy panel, said in a joint statement earlier this month, it is disappointing that some U.S. partners, including members of the Arab League, are losing their resolve to punish Assad by looking to normalize relations, including through energy deals that would involve payments to the Assad regime. The U.S. continues to call for a political solution in Syria in accordance with the 2015 UN Security Council Resolution 2254, which called for a free and fair election under UN supervision. Last Monday, U.S. Department of State spokesman Ned Price voiced support for the ongoing UN mandated talks between the Syrian government and opposition representatives in Geneva to draft a new constitution. It is essential that the Syrian regime and leaders of the opposition engage constructively in Geneva, consistent with the political process outlined in the UN Security Council Resolution 2254. The Syrian people deserve nothing less after more than a decade of war, Price said. Joe Macarone, a fellow at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C., said the U.S. administration seems interested in staying the course in Syria without advancing a major initiative to resolve the conflict. Macarone told Al Jazeera, what Blinken has said is the U.S. will not express support for normalizing with Assad, but did not specifically note it will reject or veto any overture. When Blinken delivered his remarks against normalization with Syria, he was at a joint news conference with Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed, the foreign minister of the United Arab Emirates, the Gulf country that has been the most open about restoring ties with the Assad government. Macron said Washington may dissuade a few allies from working with Assad, but for many others, the normalization train is already moving. Macron would later say, it has become increasingly difficult to make this case for Arab regimes interested in normalizing with Assad in light of the current regional dynamics and the mixed messages coming out of the Biden administration. And now it's the United States' turn at the chessboard regarding the game of Syria. However, there has been a long and sordid history involving the United States Central Intelligence Agency trying to meddle in Syrian political affairs, as well as enforcing coups within the country that goes back 75 years. CIA coups, such as the March 30th, 1949 coup, Syrian Army Colonel Husni al-Zaim, which seized power from President Shukri al-Kuwati in a bloodless coup d'etat, that are highly controversial allegations that the Syrian legation in Syria was headed by James Hugh Keeley Jr., who was an American diplomat and a second envoy to the independent nation of Syria, in which it is claimed that the CIA engineered the coup, where assistant military attaché and undercover CIA officer Stephen J. Meade, who became intimately acquainted with Colonel Zaim several weeks prior to the coup, was considering his principal Western confidant during Zaim's brief time in power, and had been described as the coup's architect, along with the CIA's Damascus station chief, Miles Copeland Jr., as well as an attempted regime change between 1956 and 1957 under Operation Struggle, where National Security Council member Wilbur Crane Eveland, CIA official Archibald Roosevelt, and Mikhail Bey Eline, former Syrian minister, met in Damascus on July 1st, 1956, to discuss a U.S.-backed anti-communist takeover of the country. Plan was scheduled to enact on October 25th, 1956, in which a report outlined that the military could take control of Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, and Hama. The frontier posts with Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon will also be captured in order to seal Syria's borders until the radio stations announced that a new government had taken over Colonel Kabani, who would place armored units of key positions through Damascus. Once control had been established, Ilian would inform the civilians he selected that they were to form a new government, but in order to avoid leaks, none of them would be told until a week before the coup. And then you had Operation Weapon in 1957, in which the director of the CIA, Alan Dulles, continued to file reports about the dangers of communism in Syria. As you can see, this is a repeated theme also in the United States. The CIA planned for another coup, which was named Operation Weapon, and was organized by Kermit Roosevelt, who was an intelligence officer who served in the Office of Strategic Services, as well as the CIA, in which Syrian military officers were paid off in anticipation. The coup failed when some of those officers revealed the plan to the Syrian intelligence services. They turned in the CIA bribe money and identified the officers who tendered it. Robert Malloy, Francis Jelton, and Howard E. Rocky Stone, who were all CIA operatives, were all deported. And of course, the assassination plot of 1957, in which the targets were Abdel Hamad al-Sarraj, head of the Syrian military intelligence, Afif al-Baziri, the Syrian army chief of staff, Khalid Bakdash, leader of the Syrian Communist Party. Details about this conspiracy were revealed by a working group report uncovered in 2003, in which the report went on to say, once a political decision is reached to proceed with internal disturbances in Syria, CIA is prepared, and MI6, British MI6, will attempt to mount minor sabotage and coup domain incidents with Syria, working through contracts with individuals. And of course, we had the extraordinary rendition between 2001 and 2003, in which the CIA used Syria as an illicit base of operations to torture so-called ghost detainees as part of a program known as extraordinary rendition. The program was established in the mid-90s under President Clinton and expanded in the 2000s. And of course, after the attacks of September 11, 2001, it really expanded under President Bush Jr., which allowed and authorized the CIA, using White House attorney John Yoo, to give authorization to torture suspected terrorists, which most of them weren't. One target of the program was Syrian-born Canadian Maher Arar, who was detained in New York and sent to Syria, where he was interrogated and tortured. Arar, a telecommunications engineer who had been a Canadian citizen since 1991, was asked to confess his connection to al-Qaeda and to terrorist training camps in Afghanistan. Arar was held for more than a year after his release, in which he sued the U.S. government. The United States initially invoked the state secrets privilege when legal proceedings began anyway. John Ashcroft, Justice Department, was ridiculed for arguing that Arar was in fact a member of al-Qaeda when he wasn't. And who can forget the paramilitary raids between 2004 and 2008, on which October 26, 2008, the CIA conducted a paramilitary raid on the town of Suqaniya in eastern Syria. The raid involved about 24 U.S. commandos and specially equipped Black Hawk helicopters, in which the U.S. had said it had killed an Iraqi who was supplying insurgents from across the Syrian border. Syria accused the U.S. of committing terrorist aggression and said that 8 civilians had been killed. The U.S. responded that all the people killed in the raid were militants. Of course they were. Of course they were. And of course, who can forget the infamous CIA operation codenamed Timber Sycamore, which was a classified weapons supply and training program run by the United States Central Intelligence Agency and supported by Arab intelligence services, including the General Intelligence Directorate, Saudi intelligence, in which it was launched in 2012, which supplied money and weaponry and training to rebel forces such as the Islamic State, Jabhat al-Nusra, Dar al-Sham, fighting Syrian President Bashar al-Assad during the Syrian civil war, in which CIA Director David Petraeus, who first proposed a program of arming and training the rebels during the summer of 2012, in which President Obama rejected initially the proposal, but later agreed because it was partly due to lobbying by foreign leaders, including King Abdullah II of Jordan and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The program was ousted when Greg Miller and Adam Entius of the Washington Post broke the story, stating that the operation has served as the centerpiece of the U.S. strategy to press Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to step aside. The program's principal backers were the United States and Saudi Arabia, but it was also supported by other regional Arab governments, including United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and the United Kingdom, as well as Israel, who were treating injured Jabhat al-Nusra fighters in Israeli hospitals at the Golan Heights. The CIA helped arrange some of the arms purchases for the Saudis, including a large deal in Croatia in 2012, in which a classified U.S. State Department cable signed by none other than Secretary of State Hillary Clinton reported that Saudi donors were a major support for Sunni militant forces globally, and some American officials worried that rebels being supported had ties to al-Qaeda. A huge operation supporting terrorists in which we're supposed to fight in the war on terror. Here we are using the CIA to fund terrorists to help a coup d'etat led by the nefarious Central Intelligence Agency. However, the operation ended in July of 2017, in which anonymous officials stated that it was President Trump with National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, the CIA Director Mike Pompeo, who had no choice at this point, had decided to phase out support for the anti-Assad jihadists. Not to mention what the United States has tried to basically pass off as truth regarding the legacy media in regards to the chemical weapons that were used by the Syrian government under Assad on its own citizens, in which we would later find out in 2019 documents published by WikiLeaks that confirmed that there is a significant dissent within the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, or the OPCW, the Global Chemical Weapons Watchdog, which over the doctoring of a public report on the alleged April 7, 2018 chemical weapons attack in Douma, which reportedly killed 49 people, wounded as many as 650. That latest round of revelations from WikiLeaks made clear that the U.S.-led regime change operation in Syria, which began in 2011, was all based on lies, headed by the State Department and the Central Intelligence Agency, as well as the Gulf and Israel. The role of WikiLeaks in exposing those lies demonstrates why the United States government had pressured Assange and ferociously tried to arrest him, in which they did. Because Julian Assange basically uncovered the role of the United States' real agendas for Syria. The question is, when are we, the public, going to hold the United States and the Central Intelligence Agency, as well as the Gulf and Israel foreign lobbyists, responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity just in Syria?